In the candlelit courts of medieval Europe, where lords and ladies whispered sweet nothings behind velvet curtains, a peculiar concept took root and flourished. It was called courtly love, and on the surface, it sounded like the purest form of romantic devotion. Songs were written about it, poems were recited in longing voices, and stories were spun with silken words about knights who would die for a single smile from their lady. But once you peel back the layers of this glittering fantasy, what you find is not eternal devotion, but an elaborate mask. Behind the troubadour's lute and the knight's flowery letters, courtly love was often nothing more than adultery in elegant disguise. Courtly love wasn't invented in royal chambers. It came to life in the 12th century among the aristocracy of southern France, particularly in the courts of Aquitaine and Provence. It was a time when marriages were political arrangements, designed to unite land and power rather than hearts and souls. Noble women were often married off as teenagers to much older men they barely knew. Affection, passion, and romance were not required ingredients in these unions. That left a gaping void in the emotional lives of noble women, and courtly love came rushing in to fill it. On the surface, courtly love seemed innocent. It was about a knight pledging himself to a lady, serving her faithfully as though she were his queen. The knight might perform daring deeds to win her favor, compose poetry in her honor, and claim that her mere presence could heal his wounds. He was not necessarily supposed to consummate the relationship. In theory, it was spiritual and chaste. But in practice, it often slipped across lines. The lady was usually married. The knight was usually not her husband. In many of these relationships, cloaked in the noble language of poetry, led straight to the bedroom. Troubadours made a thriving career out of praising these noble affairs. They wandered from court to court, serenading ladies with songs about their beauty and grace, flattering their intellect and virtue, and spinning tales about the ache of unfulfilled desire. The poetry was brilliant. The emotions seemed raw and true, but much of it was composed with a wink and a nod. Everyone in the court understood that the knight's devotion to the lady was a kind of game, and one with unspoken rules. These rules made the whole thing appear respectable. A knight had to pretend that his love was tormenting him, that he was being driven mad by longing, and that he would rather die than be unfaithful to her. At the same time, he had to hide the affair from her husband, who often pretended not to notice. The lady, in turn, had to act modest and reluctant, even if she was encouraging the knight behind closed doors. It was a dangerous dance, full of coded gestures and secret messages. And yet it became fashionable to the point of obsession. The poets of the time elevated this practice into a quasi-religion. They described the lady as a goddess, pure and unattainable, and the knight as her humble worshipper. Love, they claimed, made the man better. It refined his manners, sharpened his mind, and gave him courage. But for all their flowery language, they rarely sang about wives. Wives were part of duty. Courtly love was reserved for someone else's spouse, someone who could be admired without the burden of domestic life. In some of the most famous tales, the line between love and lust is razor-thin. The story of Lancelot and Guinevere is a prime example. Lancelot, the noblest knight of the Round Table, is madly in love with Queen Guinevere, King Arthur's wife. Their affair is described as tragic and profound, filled with suffering and moral conflict. But in the end, it tears the kingdom apart. Their love, though immortalized in poetry, is still a betrayal. This contradiction lies at the heart of courtly love. It dressed itself in the robes of virtue, but often led to betrayal, jealousy, and scandal. It asked for absolute loyalty, but offered no promise of commitment. It praised women, but only as long as they remained distant and mysterious. The minute a woman ceased to be an object of longing and became a real person with flaws and opinions, she lost her place on the pedestal. The practice also had an unsettling double standard. Men were encouraged to pursue ladies with relentless passion, even if they were clearly not interested. It was seen as romantic, not harassing. A woman was supposed to be elusive. Her resistance was part of the script. Only when a man persisted long enough could he claim to have truly loved. This idea still echoes in modern romantic narratives. A relentless pursuit is often portrayed as proof of devotion, even when it crosses boundaries. Some women used courtly love to their advantage. It gave them power in a world where they had little. A lady who received the admiration of many knights could increase her influence at court. She could control the narrative of her own desirability, even shape political alliances. But this power came with risk. If she was caught actually sleeping with a knight, the consequences could be deadly. A man might be praised for his romantic escapades, while a woman could be shamed, exiled, or even executed. The poetry of courtly love often ignored these dangers. It basked in the thrill of secrecy, the agony of yearning, the sweetness of stolen glances. It rarely spoke of the aftermath. There were no verses about ruined reputations, broken marriages, or bastard children. The ideal was always just out of reach, and perhaps that was the point. As long as the love remained unconsummated, it could be painted as noble. The moment it became real, it became a problem. Despite its romantic veneer, courtly love was never about equality. It placed women on pedestals, but only as distant idols, gave men the agency to pursue and the permission to suffer, while women were expected to inspire devotion without ever directly acting on their own desires. If a woman did confess her feelings, she was no longer mysterious. If she made the first move, she was no longer respectable. The entire game was built on imbalance. Over time, the concept of courtly love seeped into European literature and culture. It shaped the way people thought about romance, setting expectations that would echo for centuries. Even today, traces of it can be seen in the idea that true love must be dramatic, secret, and full of suffering. The myth persists that the deepest love is the forbidden kind. The love that society frowns upon, the love that demands sacrifice and heartbreak. But if you strip away the ornate language and the noble titles, courtly love reveals itself as a clever way to make adultery seem elegant. It allowed the upper class to indulge their passions without admitting to impropriety. It provided a script for desire, one that was thrilling and poetic, but ultimately dishonest. The lovers were not star-crossed heroes. They were people navigating a rigid society, finding loopholes in a system that gave them little emotional freedom. In the end, courtly love did not liberate anyone. It offered escape only through fantasy. It romanticized restraint, not freedom. It celebrated longing, not fulfillment. It allowed people to speak of love without naming what they truly wanted. And while its poetry may still enchant readers today, the reality behind the verses was far messier. These were not stories of pure hearts bound by fate. They were stories of human beings, flawed and complicated, using metaphor and rhyme to cloak their desires. So the next time you hear a medieval ballad about a noble knight pining for a lady fair, remember that behind the lute's gentle strumming was a world where love was never simple. It was negotiated in whispers, performed in riddles, and sometimes paid for in blood. Courtly love was beautiful, yes, but it was also a lie. A lie that let people believe they were chasing virtue, even as they slipped into each other's beds. Lie dressed in poetry, masking the oldest story in the world. Thanks for watching and diving into the tangled world of courtly love with us. It may have sounded romantic at first glance, filled with knights, poetry, and grand declarations, but the truth behind those verses is far from innocent. What looked like noble devotion was often just emotional escape, a poetic mask for forbidden passion. It was a time when people wrapped their desires in metaphors and rhymes, turning love into a game of glances and secrets. But the consequences were real, and the stakes were high. If you enjoyed unraveling this elegant illusion and want to explore more hidden truths from history, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Was courtly love a beautiful fantasy, or just a clever excuse for breaking the rules? We would love to hear your take. Thanks again for being here, and until next time, remember, not everything dressed in silk and poetry is as pure as it seems. History has a way of showing us that even the most romantic tales often come with a twist. See you in the next one.